The dust of the Blackwood Valley tasted of defeat. Ada Caro knew the flavor well. It was in the water from the well, in the bread from the oven, and in the silence of her husband's house. It was the taste of a life traded for a father's honor, a ghost of a price paid in fine silks and a cold bed. Her family, the Ainsworths of St. Louis, had once spoken of the West as a place of grand adventure, of fortunes waiting to be dug from the earth. They had spoken of it from the comfort of velvet chairs, with brandy glasses in their hands. They had not spoken of the dust, or the wind that scraped the soul raw, or the kind of men who built kingdoms upon it, men like Mortimer Caro. Mort was a man carved from the valley's granite, 20 years her senior. His face was a map of hard bargains and harder winters, his hands thick and capable of both breaking a wild horse and snapping a woman's spirit. He had come to her father not as a suitor, but as a creditor. The Ainsworth fortune, built on railroads and speculation, had crumbled into a pile of IOUs, and Mort Caro held the largest one. He did not ask for Ada's hand. He collected it as payment on a debt. She was 19 then, full of books and music and the naive belief that goodness was the world's natural currency. She had imagined love as a quiet conversation, a meeting of minds. With Mort, marriage was a contract of ownership. The ceremony had been a brief, sterile affair in a dusty town chapel, witnessed by men whose loyalty was bought and paid for by the Caro brand. From that day on, she was no longer Ada Ainsworth. She was Mrs. Caro, the finest possession on a ranch that stretched from the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains to the sun-scorched banks of the Serpent River. The Caro Ranch was not a home. It was a fortress. The main house stood on a rise overlooking the valley, a 2-story monument of timber and stone, its wide veranda like a perpetually frowning mouth. From there, Mort could survey his empire, thousands of acres of grazing land, hundreds of cattle, and a dozen or more ranch hands who feared him more than they feared God. His wealth, she soon learned, was as merciless as his nature. The land had been wrested from the native tribes who had hunted it for generations, their claims dismissed with a few dollars and the quiet threat of hired guns. The men who worked for him were paid just enough to keep them from starving and too little to ever leave. In the nearby town of Redemption, a name so ironic it felt like a deliberate cruelty, Mort Caro was a pillar of the community. He funded the new church steeple, donated a stud bull to a struggling homesteader, and his voice was the loudest at town meetings, always speaking of progress and order. He smiled with his mouth, but never his eyes. And the townsfolk, dependent on the wages his ranch provided, mistook his power for benevolence. They saw the generous, upright man he paid to be. Ada saw the man he was when the doors were closed. She saw him in the evenings, when he sat by the fire, cleaning his Colt Peacemaker, the soft clicks of the cylinder turning in the silence a conversation all its own. He was not a man who shouted. His cruelty was a quiet, suffocating thing. It was in the way he would move a teacup she had misplaced back to its exact spot on the saucer, his eyes holding hers until she understood the transgression. It was in the way he corrected her speech, telling her a lady did not hold such firm opinions. It was in the way he would praise her beauty to guests, his hand resting on the small of her back with a pressure that was not affectionate, but proprietary, a brand applied without heat. In the first year, she had tried to fight. She had argued, her voice trembling with the injustice of it all. That had earned her a week of absolute silence from him, a silence so complete and unnerving she felt she was becoming a ghost. He looked through her, spoke around her, until she broke and begged for him to speak to her again. He had, his voice calm and low, explaining that a harmonious home was a quiet one, and her role was to ensure that harmony. The lesson was clear. Her voice was a disruption. So she had learned to be quiet. After 2 years of this carefully managed existence, the lively, educated girl from St. Louis was gone, buried beneath layers of compliance. She did not speak back. She did not raise her eyes from her sewing. She did not fight. She moved through the grand dark house like a shadow, her footsteps light on the polished floors. Her presence felt only in the perfect arrangement of flowers on the mantelpiece and the flawless execution of meals served precisely on time. The fire inside her had not been extinguished. It had been starved of air, reduced to a single, stubborn ember glowing faintly in the deepest part of her soul. She was surviving. It was a bleak and hollow victory, but it was the only one she had. Then Eli Sayer arrived. He came on a Tuesday, in the sweltering heat of late summer, riding a tired-looking buckskin with a saddle that had seen better decades. He was just another drifter looking for work, one of a steady stream that passed through the Caro Ranch. Mort's foreman, a hard-faced man named Jeb, looked him up and down with open disdain. Eli was lean but strong, with the whipcord toughness of a man who lived in the saddle. But it was his face that set him apart. His skin was the color of dark honey, his cheekbones high and sharp, and his eyes were a deep, impenetrable brown. There was the unmistakable mark of Cherokee blood in him, a fact that in this valley made him something less than a white man, but something other than the defeated natives who lived on the reservation miles to the south. "No horses?" Jeb grunted, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Eli's worn boots. Eli's gaze was steady. He didn't look at Jeb, but at a wild-eyed sorrel fighting against its rope in a nearby corral. "Some," was all he said. His voice was low and quiet, with a rough edge to it, like stones rubbing together. Mort had been watching from the veranda, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He needed a good horsebreaker. The last one had been a drunk who had ruined a promising colt. Mort did not care about a man's blood if his hands were skilled. Skill was a commodity, like land or cattle, to be bought and used. "Put him on the sorrel," Mort called down, his voice carrying the easy authority of a king. "If he gets thrown, send him on his way. If he stays on, give him a bunk and pay him half what you paid the last man." Ada was in the kitchen, shelling peas, the rhythmic snap of the pods a dull metronome to her thoughts. She heard the commotion from the corral, the frantic whinny of the horse, the shouts of the other hands placing bets. She did not look up. The violence of the corrals was a man's world, a constant, brutal theater of domination that mirrored her own life in ways she preferred not to examine. But a different kind of silence fell, a tense, waiting quiet that was unusual. Against her will, she found herself drifting toward the kitchen window. What she saw was not the usual chaotic fight. The man, Eli, was not trying to crush the horse's spirit with spurs and whips. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, speaking to the animal in a low murmur she could not hear. There was no fear in him, but no aggression either. It was a negotiation, a patient dialogue of movement and pressure. When he finally swung into the saddle, the horse bucked and spun, a whirlwind of red fury. But Eli moved with it, an extension of the animal's own body, until the horse, exhausted and confused, finally stood trembling, its sides heaving. Eli did not grin or swagger. He simply dismounted, stroked the horse's sweat-soaked neck, and looked up. His eyes swept across the dusty yard, past the bunkhouse, past the foreman, and for a single, breath-stopping moment, they met hers through the window. It was not a look of triumph or curiosity. It was a look of quiet assessment, of seeing. Then he turned away, leading the sorrel toward the water trough. Ada stepped back from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs with an unfamiliar rhythm. From that day on, the landscape of her life had a new feature in it. Eli Sayer. He was a ghost at the edges of her vision, a silent presence that somehow made the oppressive emptiness of the ranch feel even more profound. She noticed things, the way he kept to himself, eating his meals alone at the far end of the long bunkhouse table, the way the other hands gave him a wide berth, their taunts about his heritage always muttered when he was just out of earshot. They respected his skill but resented his blood. He was an outcast among outcasts. She saw the scars, a long, thin white line that cut through his left eyebrow, a puckered knot of tissue high on his right cheekbone, the faint, latticed marks on his forearms, visible when he rolled up his sleeves to work. These were not the scars of a careless brawler. They were the hieroglyphs of a hard life, and she found herself wondering about the stories they told. Most of all, she noticed the way he walked. He moved with the quiet pride of a man who had nothing and expected nothing, who did not belong to the white world of his father or the Cherokee world of his mother, but who walked the earth as if he had a right to his place upon it anyway. It was a kind of defiance she recognized, a stubborn refusal to be erased, and it resonated with the last, flickering ember within her. Eli noticed her, too. He had seen women like her before, the fine-boned, pale-skinned wives of rich men. They were usually fragile things, like porcelain dolls kept on a high shelf, either terrified of the harsh land or disdainful of it. Ada Caro was different. She was as still and silent as a doe at the edge of a clearing, but her stillness was not born of fear. It was a deliberate, controlled thing. He saw it in the set of her jaw, the straightness of her back as she walked across the yard. And he saw it in her eyes. The one time he'd seen them up close, through the kitchen window, he had seen something that startled him. It was a fire banked low, a burning stillness that spoke of a spirit that was caged but not broken. He saw a pain there he recognized, the pain of being owned by a world you never chose. He knew that pain. It was in his own blood, a legacy from the white father who had abandoned him and his mother, and from the Cherokee mother who had taught him to be proud of a heritage that other men despised. He'd learned early to build walls around himself, to keep his temper quiet and his eyes watchful. He saw walls around her, too. High, cold walls, but he could still see the fire burning behind them. Their worlds were separate, divided by the unbridgeable chasm between the main house and the bunkhouse, between the owner and the hired hand. They existed in the same space but on different planes, their paths crossing only at a distance. She would be on the veranda, arranging her potted geraniums, and he would be in the far corral, his back to her, gentling a new colt. He would be reshoeing a horse in the blacksmith's shed, the ring of his hammer on the anvil a lonely sound in the afternoon heat, and she would walk past on her way to the vegetable garden, her head down, her wide-brimmed hat hiding her face. They never spoke. They never acknowledged each other, but the awareness was always there, a taut, invisible line drawn between them in the dusty air. The first touch was an accident, a clumsy, fleeting thing that changed everything. Ada was carrying 2 heavy wooden buckets of water from the well to her small, protected garden behind the house. It was one of the few tasks she insisted on doing herself, tending the small patch of earth, coaxing life from the dry soil, was a private rebellion, a way of creating beauty in a world of dust and brutality. Her arms ached, the muscles in her shoulders screaming in protest. Mort did not approve. He had told her such labor was unbefitting his wife. It was for the Mexican housemaid to do. But Ada persisted, clinging to this small piece of autonomy. She was halfway across the yard when her grip faltered. Her hands, soft and unaccustomed to such weight, cramped. The right bucket slipped, its wire handle tearing at her skin. With a small cry, she stumbled, and the bucket crashed to the ground, splintering along its side, sending a wave of precious, cool water darkening the thirsty earth. The other bucket fell from her other hand, sloshing but remaining upright. She stood there, trembling, looking at the mess. It was a stupid, simple failure, but in her fragile, controlled world, it felt monumental. She saw the splintered wood, the wasted water, and felt a hot sting of tears behind her eyes. It was one more thing she could not manage, one more proof of her own weakness. "Ma'am." The voice was so quiet it was almost part of the wind. She looked up, startled. Eli Sayer stood a few feet away. He must have been coming from the stables. He held no hat in his hands. and she saw the way the harsh sunlight caught the blue-black shine of his hair. His face was unreadable, his dark eyes fixed on the broken bucket. She said nothing, too mortified to speak. She bent down, her hands fumbling, trying to gather the splintered staves of wood. A sharp edge sliced into her palm, and she flinched, drawing back her hand to see a bright bead of blood welling up. Before she could react, he was there, crouching beside her. He did not reach for her hand. He reached for the other bucket, the one that was still full. His hand, brown and calloused, closed around the handle. For a second, her own hand was still resting on it. His fingers brushed against hers. It was not a spark. A spark is small and quick. This was a current, a slow, powerful surge of heat that shot up her arm and seemed to settle deep in her chest. It was the first time a man had touched her in 2 years with anything other than cold possession. This touch was different. It was simple, functional, yet it felt more intimate than any of her husband's embraces. He lifted the heavy bucket as if it weighed nothing. His eyes met hers. In their depths, she saw no pity, which she would have hated, and no insolence, which she would have feared. She saw only a quiet, solemn recognition. He saw her, not Mrs. Caro, the rancher's wife. He saw a woman with a bleeding hand and a broken bucket. He did not speak. She did not speak. The silence stretched, thick with everything that could not be said. He held her gaze for a long moment, then rose to his full height, the bucket in one hand. With his other hand, he gestured slightly toward the house, a silent question. Dazed. She nodded. He walked beside her, carrying the water to her garden, his footsteps steady on the dry ground. He set the bucket down gently beside her rows of struggling tomato plants, then turned and walked away without a backward glance, disappearing back into the masculine world of the stables and corrals. Ada stood alone, her hand throbbing, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. She looked at the dark patch of earth where the water had spilled, already starting to fade under the relentless sun. The wild western landscape, the dry plains, the jagged rocks, the endless, suffocating dust, had always seemed to her a perfect mirror for her life. It was a barren, unforgiving place, promising nothing but more of the same, stretching out to a horizon that never got any closer. But as she stood there, a breeze picked up from the east, a rare thing in the heat of the day. It stirred the leaves of the cottonwood trees by the creek and carried with it the scent of distant rain. It was a small change, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. The wind was beginning to shift. Mortimer Caro was a man who noticed things. He had built his empire on observation, on seeing the weakness in a line of fence, in a rival rancher's handshake, or in a man's character. His wife was no different from any other asset. He observed her for signs of wear, of depreciation, of malfunction, and he noticed a change. It had begun after the incident with the water bucket, a small, foolish accident. Yet it seemed to have knocked something loose in the careful mechanism of her obedience. She had never shown the slightest interest in the workings of the ranch, the corrals, the stables, the bunkhouse. These were the loud, dirty, masculine corners of his world, and she had always kept to the quiet, polished confines of the house as was proper. But now, her patterns were shifting. She would take her sewing out to the veranda in the afternoon, positioning her rocking chair at the far end, the end that overlooked the training pens where the new horsebreaker, Sayer, spent his days. She never looked at him directly, her eyes always fixed on the needlework in her lap, but she was angled toward him. Mort saw it. She took longer walks to her garden, her route now inexplicably passing by the blacksmith's shed. She would pause, ostensibly to admire a patch of wildflowers. At the exact moment Sayer was working the bellows, his back and shoulders straining with the effort, sweat glistening on his sun-darkened skin. She would linger for a minute, a still, poised figure in a pale dress against a backdrop of dust and sweat, and then move on. It happened too often to be a coincidence. Mort's suspicion. Once a formless thought began to harden into a sharp, cold certainty. He was being tested. Ada felt his watchfulness like a physical weight. She knew the risks. She knew that every step she took out of her designated path was a transgression. But the touch of Eli's hand on hers, brief as it had been, had awakened a forgotten sensation, agency. For 2 years, she had been an object, moved and positioned at her husband's will. Now, she was the one doing the moving. It was a terrifying, exhilarating power. She began to engineer moments, tiny rebellions that were hers alone. One morning, as Eli was leaving the mess hall, she walked out of the main house at the same time, her steps timed perfectly. The narrow stone path forced them to pass closely. She let the fine wool of her shawl brush against the rough canvas of his sleeve. It was nothing. It was everything. She kept her eyes forward, her expression serene, but she felt the jolt of the contact all the way to her bones. She heard his intake of breath, a sharp, surprised sound. He did not speak, and neither did she. Another time, she feigned trouble with the harness on the buggy horse, a gentle mare she was sometimes allowed to drive into Redemption for supplies, always with Mort's foreman, Jeb, riding alongside. She knew perfectly well how the buckles worked, but she fumbled with a leather strap, a look of helpless frustration on her face, until one of the younger hands offered to fetch Eli. The man who knew horses best. Eli came, his face a mask of wary reluctance. He kept his eyes down, refusing to look at her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. "This strap," she said, her own voice sounding strange and high in her ears. "It seems caught." He knelt, his hands moving with deft, impersonal skill. He smelled of leather and hay and clean sweat, a scent so different from the cloying bay rum her husband wore. He fixed the strap in under 10 seconds. As he stood up, his gaze flickered to hers for a fraction of a second. She saw the warning in his eyes, a clear, desperate plea for her to stop. "It's fixed, ma'am," he said, and turned on his heel, walking away before she could say another word. Eli resisted her. He resisted with every fiber of his being. He was a man who had survived by being invisible, by attracting no attention, and Ada Caro was a walking beacon of danger. He knew what men like Mort did to things they could not control. He had seen it. He carried the memories like scars. He remembered a saloon girl in a town in the New Mexico territory, a girl who had laughed too long with the wrong man. Her boss, a man with a possessive streak and a quick temper, had beaten her so badly she never walked right again. He remembered a young homesteader's wife, accused of being too friendly with a passing survey crew. Her husband, shamed and furious, had locked her away, and the light had gone out of her eyes until she was just a walking ghost. He had seen women used and discarded, their spirits broken and their bodies buried on lonely hillsides, all for stepping outside the lines drawn by a jealous man. Ada Caro was not just stepping outside the lines. She was trying to erase them, and she was using him as her chalk every time she manufactured a reason to be near him. He felt a cold dread coil in his gut. He tried to warn her with his eyes, with the rigid set of his shoulders, with the clipped, formal way he addressed her. He was trying to tell her that this was a game she could not win, that the price of her rebellion would be paid by both of them. But she did not seem to see it, or perhaps she did not care. She looked at him with those haunted, burning eyes, and he felt like a man standing on a cliff edge, with a storm gathering at his back. The nights were the most dangerous. Sleep offered little escape for Ada. Her dreams were often of her old life in St. Louis, of a world of light and laughter that now felt as distant as a foreign country. She would wake in the large, cold bed she shared with her husband, his heavy, rhythmic breathing a reminder of her cage. On those nights, she would slip from the bed, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor, and go to the window of her upstairs bedroom. The window looked out over the main yard, over the dark shapes of the stables and the corrals, and there, under the stark silver light of the moon, she would often see him. Eli preferred to work late, grooming the horses himself, taking a quiet satisfaction in the task. He moved with an unhurried rhythm, the curry comb scraping in a steady, soothing cadence. In the moonlight, he looked like a figure from an older, wilder time. The harsh lines of the ranch softened, and the world seemed to shrink until it contained only that quiet space of man and horse. She would watch him for an hour or more, a silent vigil. He seemed to carry his solitude around him like a cloak, but it did not seem to be a loneliness born of sadness. It was a chosen state, a place of peace. She envied it. She envied his freedom to be alone, to be himself when no one was watching. One night, as he finished with a handsome bay gelding, he paused, his hand resting on the horse's flank. He stood perfectly still, as if listening to something only he could hear, and then, slowly, as if he had known she was there all along, he lifted his head and looked directly up at her window. Ada's breath caught in her throat. She did not move, did not shrink back into the shadows. The distance was too great for him to see her face clearly, but he knew. She felt it, and he did not look away. For a long, silent minute, their gazes held across the moonlit yard. It was a conversation without words, an acknowledgement of the invisible thread that now connected them. In his unblinking stare, she saw no judgment, no fear, only a deep, profound sorrow. It was as if he was looking at a woman already lost. Then he gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head and turned, leading the horse into the darkness of the stable. Ada finally stepped back from the window, her body trembling. He had not broken the connection. She had. In early autumn, when the cottonwoods along the river began to turn a fiery gold, Mort decided to host a dinner gathering. It was an annual event, a display of power dressed up as hospitality. He invited the mayor of Redemption, the town banker, several neighboring ranchers whose land he was slowly encroaching upon, and a handful of his most loyal, most dangerous hired guns, men who served as a stark reminder of how he maintained order in his valley. The house was filled with the smell of roasting beef and beeswax. Ada was ordered to oversee the preparations, a task she performed with her usual silent efficiency. As she directed the housemaid, she felt her husband's eyes on her constantly. He was testing her again, putting her on display. "Ada, my dear," he said. As the guests began to arrive, he stood before the great stone fireplace, a glass of bourbon in his hand, the very picture of the benevolent patriarch. "You will play the piano for us after dinner. Something pleasant. One of those pieces by that fellow, Chopin." She nodded. "Of course, Mortimer." "And smile," he added, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "They all admire you so. Let them see how happy you are here." His fingers brushed her cheek, a touch that felt as cold as a stone. She was his perfect possession, and tonight she was to be polished and shown off. The dinner was an ordeal of false smiles and veiled threats. The men talked of cattle prices, of the trouble with the railroad, and of the need for a firmer hand with the natives on the reservation. The women spoke of their children and their gardens. Ada sat at the head of the table opposite her husband, a silent, beautiful centerpiece. She ate little, her stomach a tight knot of dread. Across the room, standing near the doorway to the kitchen, was Eli. He and two other hands had been brought in to help serve the whiskey and clear the plates, a humiliation that was part of their job. He never looked in her direction, his face impassive, his eyes fixed on some distant point over the heads of the guests. He was a piece of furniture, a tool, and it was a deliberate cruelty on Mort's part to have him there. After the plates were cleared, a hush fell over the room. Mort gestured toward the piano. "Ada." She rose, her silk dress rustling, and walked to the polished rosewood piano. She sat, her back straight, and for a moment she let her fingers rest on the cool ivory keys. Then she began to play, The music flowed from her, technically perfect, each note precise and clear, but it was hollow. It was the music of a machine, devoid of the passion she had once felt. It was the sound of her own soul, caged and compliant. The guests murmured their appreciation. Mort beamed, accepting their compliments as if he himself had produced the melody. When the final note faded, there was a polite burst of applause. Ada stood up, turning to face the room. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She looked at her husband, at his smug, proprietary smile. She looked at the faces of the guests, the men who admired Mort's power and the women who envied his wife. And then she looked past them all, to the tall, silent figure standing by the door.
This was it, the cliff edge.
She did not go back to her seat. She began to walk, her steps slow and deliberate, across the plush Persian rug. A confused silence fell as every eye in the room followed her. She walked past the banker, past the mayor, past her husband's most feared gunman. She walked directly toward Eli Sayer. He saw her coming, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something in his guarded eyes. It was pure, unadulterated panic. He tensed, his body going rigid, a cornered animal looking for an escape that wasn't there. She stopped directly in front of him, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. The entire room held its breath. She could feel Mort's gaze on her back, a physical force, hot and sharp. This was not about love. It was not about desire. It was about a declaration. It was war. Without a word, she reached up, her hands surprisingly strong, and tangled her fingers in the front of his rough spun shirt. She pulled him down toward her. He resisted for a second, his muscles like steel, but she was relentless. She forced his face down to hers and crushed her mouth against his. A collective gasp swept through the room. Someone dropped a glass, the sound shattering the silence. Eli was frozen, a statue of shock and disbelief. His lips were stiff, unyielding, but she did not care. This was not for him. This was for the man watching. She pressed harder, forcing his lips to part, a desperate, angry kiss that tasted of whiskey and despair. The world seemed to fall away. There was only the rough texture of his shirt under her fingers, the stunning immobility of his body, and the furious pounding of her own blood in her ears. She held the kiss for an eternity, for 5 seconds, forcing every person in that room to be a witness to her treason. Then, with a strangled cry, Eli broke away. He shoved her back, not violently, but with the desperate strength of a drowning man pushing for the surface. His face was pale beneath his tan, his eyes wide with a mixture of fury and terror. He stared at her for one searing moment, then turned and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. Ada stood alone in the center of the room, her body trembling from head to foot. She could feel the scorch of 24 pairs of eyes on her. Slowly, she turned to face her husband. Mortimer Caro had not moved. He still stood by the fireplace, his drink still in his hand. His face was a placid mask, but a single muscle in his jaw ticked, a frantic, tiny betrayal of the inferno raging beneath the surface. He did not speak. He did not scream. He simply looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a cold, possessive fury that was more terrifying than any physical violence. He was a man whose most prized possession had just spit in his face in front of the entire world. He would not destroy it. He would simply take it apart, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. The last guest departed in a hurried, embarrassed clatter of hooves and buggy wheels, melting into the night like frightened ghosts. The house fell into a silence so profound it was louder than the preceding chaos. Ada stood where Eli had left her, a lone pillar in the wreckage of the evening. She did not look at her husband. She did not need to. She could feel his quiet fury radiating across the room, a cold, killing heat. Mortimer Caro finally moved. He walked to the sideboard and deliberately poured himself another bourbon, his movements unnaturally steady. He drank it down in one smooth motion, then set the glass down with a soft, definitive click. "Go upstairs, Ada," he said. His voice was perfectly level, devoid of any emotion. It was the voice he used when giving an order to hang a rustler. She turned and walked, her legs feeling like brittle sticks that might snap with each step. She did not run. She ascended the grand staircase, her hand gliding over the polished banister, one measured tread after another. She was aware of him following. His heavy, deliberate footfalls, a drumbeat counting down her final seconds of freedom. She reached their bedroom and walked inside, stopping in the center of the room, her back to the door. She heard him enter behind her. She waited for the blow, for the explosion of rage she had so carefully engineered. It did not come. Instead, she heard him step back out into the hallway. Then came the sound that would define her new world. The sharp, metallic grate of a key turning in the lock from the outside. A heavy final clunk as the bolt slid home. She spun around, her heart seizing in her chest. She stared at the solid oak door, at the cold, unmoving brass of the doorknob. She was a prisoner. The shock was so complete, so absolute, that for a moment she could not breathe. He had not laid a hand on her. He had simply erased her world, shrinking it to the four walls of their bedroom. The first day was a trial of silence. No one came. No food was brought. The pitcher of water on her washstand was her only sustenance. She paced the room, a caged animal, her silk dress a mockery of her circumstances. By evening, a gnawing hunger had begun. She refused to give him the satisfaction of begging. She would not beat on the door or scream from the window. Her defiance had been public. Her endurance would be private. She held her ground. The second day, the hunger became a dull, constant ache. Thirst was worse. She drank the last of the water, her throat dry and raw. The silence pressed in on her, broken only by the mundane sounds of the ranch filtering up from below, the ring of the blacksmith's hammer, the distant lowing of cattle, the shouts of men. Life was going on without her. She lay on the bed, her body growing weak, and stared at the ceiling, tracing the patterns in the plaster. This was his true punishment, not a swift, violent act, but a slow, quiet dismantling of her body and her will. But as her body weakened, her will hardened into a diamond-sharp point of resistance. He could starve her, he could lock her away, but the choice she had made was still hers. That he could not take. Down in the bunkhouse, the air was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with the coming winter. Eli Sayer was a pariah. The other hands, who had once given him a wide berth out of a mixture of fear and contempt, now avoided him with an almost religious fervor. He was tainted, marked by the Caro wife's madness. They spoke in hushed tones when he passed, their eyes skittering away. He was the walking embodiment of a line that had been crossed, and no one wanted to be standing near him when the lightning struck. He knew he had to leave. He had known it the second her lips touched his. To stay was suicide. Mort Caro was not a man who forgot. He was a man who collected debts, and the debt Eli now owed was impossibly high. He moved with a grim, methodical purpose, stuffing his few belongings into his worn leather saddlebags. A spare shirt, a bar of soap, the small, leather-bound volume of Shakespeare his mother had insisted he learn to read. He did not own much. He had learned long ago that possessions were anchors, and a man like him needed to be able to drift with the tide. He worked the saddle soap into the dry leather of his gear, his hands moving with an automatic, practiced motion. But his mind was not on the task. It was replaying the moment in the dining room. The feel of her hands on his shirt, the desperate, almost violent pressure of her mouth. It had not been a kiss of passion. He knew what that felt like. This had been an act of immolation. She had set herself on fire and tried to drag him into the flames with her. And yet, something inside him could not condemn her. He had seen the look in her eyes just before she had reached for him. It was not the look of a mad woman. It was the look of a prisoner setting a match to the prison walls, knowing she would be caught in the blaze. He finished his packing and slung the heavy bags over his shoulder. He walked to the stables, the other hands melting away from his path. He saddled his buckskin, the familiar creak of the leather a comforting sound in the hostile silence. He was ready. All he had to do was mount his horse and ride out of this valley. Ride until the Carrow brand was nothing but a bad memory. He put his foot in the stirrup, his hand on the saddle horn. And he stopped. His body was poised to leave, but some invisible force held him fast. He stood there, one foot on the ground, one in the stirrup, caught between flight and something else, something he refused to name. The smell of the hay, sweet and dusty, filled his nostrils, and it triggered a memory. He was a boy again, no more than 10, standing on a small patch of land by a creek in the Cherokee Nation. It was not a ranch, just a small farm. His mother, Alani, had carved out of the wilderness. She was a woman with hands that were never still, hands that could soothe a sick calf, weave a tight basket, and pull a stubborn root from the rocky soil. She was also a woman who had been betrayed by love. His father, a white trapper named Sayer, had drifted into her life with promises and blue eyes, and drifted out again just as easily, leaving her with a son whose face was a constant reminder of a world that would never fully claim him. Eli remembered the day the men came. They were white men, like his father, but their eyes were hard and greedy. They had papers from the government, official-looking documents that said this land, her land, the land her people had lived on for 1,000 years, was no longer hers. It had been sold. He remembered the cold, quiet fury in his mother's face. She did not weep. She did not scream or rage. She stood on her porch, straight-backed and proud, and watched them as they hammered stakes into the ground, marking out the boundaries of her dispossession. That night, as they packed their few belongings onto a cart, he had raged for her. He had thrown a rock at one of the new fence posts, his small body trembling with a helpless, boyish fury. His mother had taken him by the shoulders, her grip firm. "Hush now, Eli," she had said, her voice quiet but strong as riverstone. "Anger is a fire. If you let it burn wild, it will consume you. You must learn to bank it, to keep the coals hot, so you can use it when you need it." He had looked at her, at the injustice of it all, and asked her why she did not fight them, why she did not scream at them for what they were doing. Her dark eyes had held his. "Some women fight fire with silence. My son," she had told him, her voice a low murmur that he would never forget. "They endure, they survive. That is its own kind of war. Others burn the house down." He had not understood then, but he understood now. He slowly took his foot out of the stirrup. Ada Carrow was not a woman who fought with silence. He had seen the flames in her eyes. She was a woman who would burn the house down. And her husband, he realized with a sickening certainty, was about to hand her the matches. While Ada starved in her room, Mort went to town. He did not ride in with his usual swagger. He rode in on his calmest mare, his face a mask of weary sorrow. He went first to the general store, then to the saloon, speaking in low, concerned tones to anyone who would listen. "It is a terrible affliction," he told Mayor Thompson, shaking his head sadly over a glass of whiskey. "Her mother, suffered from a delicate constitution, nerves. It seems the women in her family are prone to these spells." "Spells?" the mayor asked, his eyes wide with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. "Melancholy. Fantasies," Mort said, sighing heavily. "She imagines things, becomes overwrought. That unfortunate display the other night was the worst of it. The poor girl did not even know what she was doing." He let that sink in. "I fear the isolation out here is too much for her. I have written to her family. We think it best she be sent back east for a time, to a quiet place, a sanatorium where she can receive proper treatment and rest." The story spread through Redemption like a grass fire. Mrs. Carrow was unstable and hysteric. a poor, fragile creature whose mind had been broken by the harshness of the West. It was a perfect narrative. It explained her shocking behavior, preserved Mort's dignity, and transformed his cruelty into a husband's compassionate concern. No one questioned it. Mort Caro was a powerful man, and his version of the truth was the only one that mattered. No one stepped in. Eli heard the rumors from the stable boy, a pimply youth who repeated the town gossip with wide-eyed relish. "They're sending her to an asylum back east," the boy said. "Mr. Caro says her mind is broke." The words hit Eli like a physical blow. An asylum. It was a prison sentence worse than death. They would drug her, bleed her, lock her in a dark room until the fire in her eyes was nothing but a dull, empty ash. He thought of his mother, driven from her land, forced to live on the fringes, but always with her spirit intact. He thought of Ada, taking that terrible risk, making that desperate, public stand. And he thought of what his mother had said. Some women burn the house down. But you could not burn down a house if you were already chained inside it. In that moment, the choice was no longer his to make. He could not ride away. He could not leave her to that fate. It was not about honor. It was not about heroism. It was simpler and more primal than that. You do not stand by and watch a fire be extinguished. Not a fire like that. That night, a cold wind howled down from the mountains, carrying the first real bite of winter, under the cover of a moonless, starless sky. Eli moved. He was a shadow, slipping through the darkness of the ranch yard, his boots making no sound on the hard-packed earth. He carried nothing but a hunting knife and a length of rope. He circled the main house, a silent, imposing fortress. He knew the layout, the habits of the occupants. Mort was a heavy sleeper. The two housemaids slept in a small room off the kitchen. He found his entry point, a small, unlocked window in the cold cellar, half hidden by overgrown rose bushes. He slid it open and dropped into the damp, earthy darkness below. Moving through the house was like navigating a tomb. The air was still and cold. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a gunshot in the silence. He made his way to the main staircase and ascended, his hand just brushing the banisters she had touched. He found her door at the end of the hall. He had no key. He took out his knife, the blade a sliver of darkness in the gloom. He worked it into the frame, prying, pushing, until with a sharp crack of splintering wood, the lockkeeper gave way. He pushed the door open. The room was cold and smelled of sickness and stale air. A faint gray light from the window illuminated her form on the bed. She was so still he thought for a terrifying second that he was too late. "Ada," he whispered, his voice a rough crackle. She stirred, her head turning on the pillow. Even in the dim light, he could see how much weight she had lost. Her face was gaunt, her eyes huge and dark in their shadowed sockets, but they were lucid, and they were blazing. "You came," she rasped, her voice thin and dry. "Get up," he said, his tone urgent. "We have to go, now." She tried to rise, but her legs gave way. She was weaker than he had thought. He swept the blankets aside, scooped her into his arms, and was shocked at how little she weighed. She was a bird, a fragile collection of bones. She did not protest. She simply let her head fall against his shoulder. A silent surrender, not of will, but of a body that had reached its limit. He carried her out of the room, down the stairs, and back through the silent, sleeping house. He passed through the cellar and out into the biting wind. He had left his horse saddled and waiting in a thicket of cottonwoods down by the creek. Getting her on the horse was clumsy. She was a dead weight, her body shivering uncontrollably now in the cold air. He mounted behind her, pulling her back against his chest, wrapping one arm around her waist to hold her in place. "Hold on," he grunted, and spurred the horse, not back toward the main trail, but up into the dark, unforgiving maw of the Dragoon Mountains. They rode for hours, the wind tearing at them, the world a chaos of darkness and treacherous ground. As they climbed higher, the wind grew teeth, and the first flakes of snow began to fall. At first, it was a light dusting, but soon it was a thick, blinding curtain of white, a sudden, violent blizzard that had swept down from the peaks without warning. The trail disappeared. The world dissolved into a swirling vortex of wind and snow. Ada was shivering violently now, her teeth chattering so hard he could feel the vibrations through his entire body. He knew they would not survive the night out in the open. He scanned the landscape, his eyes straining in the darkness, searching for any kind of shelter. He saw it by pure luck, a dark opening in a wall of rock, a shallow cave half hidden by a curtain of falling snow. He guided the horse toward it, dismounted, and lifted her down. She could not stand. He half carried, half dragged her into the relative shelter of the cave. It was not much, a shallow overhang, but it broke the force of the wind. He settled her against the back wall, stripped the saddle blanket from the horse, and wrapped it around her, then tethered the miserable animal just inside the mouth of the cave. They needed a fire. He searched the floor of the cave, his hands numb with cold, and found a small pile of frozen brush and twigs, likely left by some prospector or hunter. It was damp, almost useless. He used his knife to shave a few dry slivers from the driest-looking branch. He struck a match. The flame flickered, then died. He struck another, and another. Finally, on the last match, a tiny flame caught on the shavings. He shielded it with his body, coaxing it, feeding it tiny twigs until it grew into a small, courageous fire, pushing back the darkness and the killing cold. He sat down beside Ada, pulling her close, trying to share the heat of his own body. She was still shivering, but less violently now. The firelight flickered across her pale, exhausted face. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the howl of the storm outside. Finally, she turned her head, her cheek resting against the rough wool of his jacket. Her voice, when she spoke, was a ragged whisper, barely audible over the wind. "Don't say you came to save me." He looked down at her, confused. Her eyes were open, fixed on his, their intensity undiminished by her weakness. "Say you came because you wanted me," she whispered. Eli stared into her eyes, into the depths of her defiant, unbreakable spirit. She was not asking for a confession of love. She was demanding an acknowledgement of her own power, a testament that her act had not been one of madness, but one of deliberate, world-altering force. She needed to know that he had not come as a hero to a victim, but as a man drawn to a woman, an equal. He did not have the words to answer her. Words were lies. They were promises a man like his father made and broke. Words were what the men with papers had used to steal his mother's land. He had no faith in them. So, Eli did not answer. He simply tightened his arm around her, pulling her even closer to the warmth of his body and the small, defiant fire. He did not let go. The snowstorm that had been their salvation became their prison. For 2 days, they were trapped in the shallow cave, the world outside a howling white void. Ada, recovering from her forced starvation, drifted in and out of a weak, feverish sleep. Eli tended to the fire, rationing the last of his dried jerky, his silence as vast and profound as the storm itself. When the wind finally died and a weak, watery sun broke through the clouds, it revealed a world transformed, draped in a blanket of blinding white. The mountains were beautiful, but it was a hostile beauty, a beauty that could kill. Their flight began in earnest. They descended from the snow-covered peaks into the cold, high desert, a landscape of skeletal yucca and red rock formations that rose from the earth like the bones of ancient giants. They traveled by night, hiding during the day in narrow canyons or thickets of mesquite. Their world shrunk to the necessities of survival: water, food, and concealment. They were hunted. Eli knew it in his bones. A man like Mort Caro did not let go of what was his. The first proof came in a small, dusty settlement on the edge of the territory, a place with little more than a general store and a saloon. While Ada waited with the horse in a dry wash, Eli slipped into town to buy flour and coffee. Nailed to the wall next to the sheriff's office was a freshly printed poster. His own face, crudely drawn, stared back at him. Wanted, $500. Reward Eli Sayer for horse theft and the kidnapping of Mrs. Ada Caro, half-breed. Scar over left eye. Quiet-spoken, but dangerous. Approach with caution. Contact Mortimer Caro at the Blackwood Valley Ranch. Eli felt a cold fury tighten his chest. Kidnapping. Mort was controlling the story, painting Ada as a helpless victim and him as a savage predator. It was a lie that would travel faster and further than the truth ever could. He tore the poster from the wall, crumpled it in his fist, and slipped away before anyone noticed him. That night, he told her, he expected fear, perhaps even regret. Instead, Ada's eyes hardened. "He is not just hunting you, Eli," she said, her voice low and steady. "He is erasing me. He is telling the world I have no mind of my own." The injustice of it seemed to fuel her, burning away the last traces of the compliant woman she had been. From that day on, she was no longer a passenger in their escape. She insisted on becoming a partner. The fine silk dress she had escaped in was now a tattered ruin. She used Eli's knife to cut the long skirt short for easier riding and used the scraps to patch the growing holes in his shirt. Her hands, once soft and accustomed to ivory piano keys, grew calloused and competent. She learned to snare rabbits, her stomach turning at first, but her determination overriding her revulsion. She learned to cook over a smoky fire, producing tough, stringy meat and coffee boiled with bitter alkali water. But it was sustenance, and she had provided it. She insisted on taking a watch at night, sitting with Eli's rifle across her lap, her eyes scanning the dark, silent landscape while he slept. Her greatest insistence was on learning to shoot. "No," Eli said flatly. The first time she asked, they were camped in a narrow, rock-strewn arroyo, the setting sun painting the canyon walls in shades of blood and rust. "I am not a child," she retorted, her chin lifting in a gesture of defiance he was coming to recognize. "I will not be helpless. If they find us, I will not stand by and watch you die for me. You'll be more danger to yourself than to anyone else. Then teach me not to be—" He resisted for another day, but her quiet, stubborn persistence wore him down. He finally handed her his Colt revolver, the one he kept tucked in his saddlebag. She was surprised by its weight. It was a heavy, solid, brutal thing. "It is not a toy," he said, his voice grim. "You only ever point it at something you mean to kill. You understand?" She nodded, her throat dry. His instruction was patient and practical. He showed her how to load it, how to hold it with two hands to steady her aim, how to brace for the kick. He set a tin can on a rock 50 feet away. "Breathe out slow," he told her, his voice low in her ear as he stood behind her. "Squeeze the trigger. Do not pull it." She fired. The explosion was deafening, a violent roar that seemed to tear the air apart. The gun kicked back hard, the butt slamming into the palm of her hand, sending a painful jolt up her arm. The bullet went wide, kicking up a puff of dust 10 feet to the left of the can. Her ears rang. The smell of gunpowder, acrid and sharp, filled her nostrils. She was trembling, but she did not drop the gun. She looked at Eli, her eyes wide. He simply nodded and pointed at the can. Again. She spent the afternoon shooting, until her arm ached and her ears buzzed. By the end, she could hit the can 1 time out of 3. It was not expert, but it was a start. She had held the power of life and death in her hand, and it had changed her. The fear was still there, but now it was accompanied by a cold, hard resolve. The nights were a strange mixture of intimacy and distance. They slept a few feet apart, rolled in their separate blankets, close enough to share the warmth of the fire, but never touching. The vast, star-filled silence of the desert was their constant companion. In the flickering firelight, The carefully constructed walls they kept around themselves began to crack. One night, as she was cleaning the rifle, her movements now practiced and sure, he spoke into the darkness. "Why did you do it?" She did not have to ask what he meant. The memory of the dining room, of her hand in his shirt, was always there between them. "I told you," she said quietly, not looking at him. "It was war. It was my life you put on the table," he said, his voice raw. "My neck in the noose." She finally looked at him. "And mine?" she shot back. "Was I not already in a prison? Was my life my own? I chose to fight with the only weapon I had? Me." "Yes," she said, her gaze unflinching. You were the one thing he could not control, the one thing that was not his." A tense silence fell between them. He stared into the fire, his face a mask of old hurts and deep-seated mistrust. "Love is a fool's game," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It is a story white men tell. My father told it to my mother. He gave her a son with a white man's name and then he left. Love is a promise that is always broken." Ada felt a surge of anger, not at him, but at the world that had taught him that. "You think you know what it is?" she challenged him. "I lived with a man who called it love to own me. He bought me, kept me, and would have seen me rot in an asylum, all in the name of his love. That is not love. That is possession." She put down the rifle and moved closer to the fire, her eyes blazing with a passion that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with conviction. Love is not softness. It is not pretty words. It is choosing someone when it hurts. It is putting your life on the table for them, just like you did for me when you came back to that house. He looked up at her, his dark eyes searching her face in the firelight. He saw no manipulation, no feminine wiles. He saw a truth, hard won and paid for in pain. That was as stark and real as the rock beneath them. What she was saying was terrifying. It was a responsibility, a bond that he had spent his entire life avoiding. Slowly, he reached out and his fingers brushed her cheek. It was a gesture of such hesitant tenderness that it made her breath catch. He leaned in, and this time, the kiss was his choice. It started gently, a soft, questioning pressure of his lips on hers. It was an apology for his harsh words and an acknowledgement of hers. Then, as she responded, her own lips parting, the kiss deepened. It became hungry, desperate, a release of all the unspoken tension, the fear, the loneliness, and the fierce, unwilling admiration that had simmered between them for weeks. It was not the kiss of a gentle romance. It was the kiss of two survivors, clinging to each other in the wreckage of their lives. From that night, the space between their blankets disappeared. Their connection became physical, an unspoken need that was as urgent and necessary as finding water. It was a passion born of desperation, a way of feeling alive in a world that wanted them dead. There was no softness in their lovemaking. It was raw, fierce, and silent, a way of speaking a language of need and comfort that neither of them dared put into words. But the danger was always there, a third presence in their bedrolls, a shadow that loomed over every touch, every shared glance. After weeks on the run, their supplies were low and his horse had thrown a shoe. They needed a town, a place to rest and resupply, a place where they could disappear for a few days. They found it in a remote mining town called Last Chance Gulch, tucked high in the mountains, a raw, muddy street lined with canvas tents, rough-hewn saloons, and the occasional clapboard storefront. It was a place where people came to lose themselves in the search for gold, a place where no one asked questions because everyone had a past they wanted to forget. Eli bought a new shirt and a sturdy dress for Ada, clothes that made them look like any other struggling couple trying to make a new start. He paid for a room above the noisiest saloon, a small, grimy space with a lumpy mattress and a single window that looked out onto a dirty alley. To Ada, it felt like a palace. It had 4 walls and a door that locked from the inside. They were Mr. and Mrs. Smith. For 3 days, they glimpsed a life they could never have. They shared meals at a small table in their room. He repaired his gear while she mended their clothes. They spoke more than they ever had before, sharing small, fragmented stories of their pasts. He told her of his mother, of her quiet strength and her knowledge of the land. She told him of her love for books, of a life in St. Louis that now felt like a dream. One evening, as she was trying to cook a passable stew on the small, rusty stove in their room, she made a mistake with the salt, making the concoction nearly inedible. She looked at the ruined meal in despair, on the verge of tears. Eli tasted it, his face grimacing in an exaggerated, comical way. "Well," he said, his voice laced with a dry humor she had never heard from him before. "At least we know Mort's men will never find us. They would just have to follow the trail of dead animals we have poisoned with our cooking." A sound escaped Ada's throat that she did not recognize. It was a short, rusty bark at first. Then it grew into a full, genuine laugh. It was the first time she had laughed in years, and the sound of it was a revelation. It was the sound of a part of herself she thought had died. Eli watched her, and a rare, small smile touched his own lips. In that moment, in that grimy little room, they were not fugitives. They were just a man and a woman, laughing over a ruined dinner. The peace was a fragile, beautiful illusion, and it was shattered the next morning. A woman who worked cleaning the rooms in the saloon, a tired, washed-out woman with eyes that had seen too much hardship, recognized Ada from a trip she had once made to Redemption. She had seen the posters. $500 was more money than she had seen in her entire life. It was enough to get her out of Last Chance Gulch forever. She went to the telegraph office. Eli sensed the change first. The mood on the street was different. Men were looking at them, their glances lingering too long. He grabbed Ada's arm. "We are leaving," he said, his voice low and urgent. They were throwing their things together when the door to their room splintered inwards, kicked open with brutal force. 2 men stood there, faces Ada recognized with a jolt of pure terror. It was Jeb, Mort's foreman, and another of the ranch's hired guns. Jeb held a shotgun, its twin barrels looking like 2 dark, empty eyes. "Well now, look what we have here," Jeb sneered, his gaze sweeping over the room, over the single bed, lingering on Ada with a leering satisfaction. "The boss was right. He said the half-breed stole you away. Time to go home, Mrs. Caro." Eli moved, pushing Ada behind him, his hand already reaching for the Colt on his hip, but he was too slow. The room exploded with the roar of the shotgun. The blast was meant for his chest, but as he had moved, it caught him high in the shoulder, spinning him around. He staggered back, a dark, spreading stain blossoming on his shirt, his face a mask of shock and pain. Ada screamed. Jeb was already leveling the shotgun for a second shot. In that split second, with gun smoke burning her eyes and the world dissolving into chaos, Ada reacted. She grabbed the heavy iron skillet from the stove and threw it with all her might. It struck the other man in the face, sending him reeling back with a cry of pain. That was the opening Eli needed. Despite the fire in his shoulder, he drew his Colt and fired. The shot was wild, but it made Jeb dive for cover. Ada did not wait. She grabbed Eli's arm, pulling him toward the window. He was stumbling, his legs unsteady, a look of dazed confusion on his face. "The window!" she screamed. They scrambled out the window, dropping 10 feet into the muddy alley below. They landed in a heap, the fall jarring every bone in Ada's body. Eli groaned, his face pale. The shouting from the room above told them they had only seconds. Ada hauled him to his feet. He was a dead weight, leaning on her, his breathing coming in ragged gasps. She half-dragged, half-carried him down the alley, away from the sounds of pursuit. Their horse was at the livery. She got him there, somehow finding the strength to boost him into the saddle. He slumped forward, barely conscious. She untied the reins, scrambled up behind him, and kicked the horse into a desperate gallop, riding hard out of town, away from the brief, beautiful mirage of peace, and back into the unforgiving wilderness. She was no longer the passenger in her own life. She was in control now, with a wounded man slumped against her back, and the hunt closing in behind them. The world dissolved into a frantic, rhythmic agony. There was the burning fire in Eli's shoulder, the jarring slam of the horse's gallop, and the icy wind that sliced at Ada's face. Eli was a dead weight against her back, his ragged groans lost in the thunder of their flight. She rode with a blind, primal instinct, pushing the horse eastward, higher into the jagged, pine-choked mountains, leaving the brief, false promise of Last Chance Gulch far behind. Night fell, and the temperature plummeted. Eli's groans subsided into a terrifying silence. He was burning with fever, his body radiating a dry, unnatural heat that seeped through her clothes. She knew, with a certainty that was a cold knot of dread in her stomach, that if they did not find shelter, he would die. He would die in the saddle, and she would be alone in this vast, indifferent wilderness. She pushed on, her own body numb with exhaustion, her mind a singular point of focus. Shelter. Through the dense timber, under a sliver of a moon that offered little light, she saw it, a ghost of a structure, a dark, angular shape against the trees that was not made by nature. An abandoned cabin. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through her. She guided the exhausted horse toward it, half sliding from the saddle and somehow managing to ease Eli's limp body to the ground. The cabin was a wreck. The porch had rotted through in places, and the chinking was gone from between many of the logs, leaving gaps for the wind to whistle through. But the door, though hanging on one leather hinge, was still there, and the stone fireplace and chimney looked solid. It was a haven. Getting him inside was the hardest thing she had ever done. He was all dead weight, his boots dragging in the dirt, his body a burden that seemed impossible to move. She gritted her teeth, her muscles screaming, and dragged him over the threshold, collapsing with him onto the dusty floorboards. For a moment, she lay there, gasping for breath, the world spinning around her. Then, she pushed herself up. There was no time for weakness. The next 3 days became a blur, a waking nightmare fueled by terror and a will she did not know she possessed. She found a rusty axe head and used it to break up the remains of a wooden table for firewood. She coaxed a flame to life in the great stone fireplace, a small, wavering light against the encroaching darkness. She found a stream nearby and used her shawl to carry water, soaking the cloth and wringing it out into a cracked clay pot she'd found on the mantelpiece. His wound was bad. The shotgun pellets had torn a ragged, ugly hole in the flesh of his shoulder. The blood had soaked through his shirt and caked into a stiff, dark map of his injury. She knew, with the cold, clear logic of survival, that she had to clean it or the fever would consume him. Steeling herself, she took his hunting knife and cut the shirt from his body. The sight of the mangled flesh made her stomach heave, but she swallowed the sickness down. She heated water in the pot and tore strips from her own petticoat to make bandages. She took the bottle of whiskey from his saddlebag, the one he had bought in town. She poured a little between his cracked lips, then, taking a deep breath, poured the rest directly into the wound. He did not scream. A raw, guttural sound was torn from his throat, and his body arched in a silent agony that was far more terrible than any scream. His eyes, which had been closed, flew open, but they were glassy and unseeing. Then, he mercifully passed out, shaking, her hands slick with whiskey and blood. She cleaned the wound as best she could and bound it tightly with the clean strips of cloth. She did not sleep. For 3 days and 3 nights, she was his keeper. She fed the fire, dribbled water into his mouth, and bathed his burning skin with cool, damp rags. The cabin, their tiny sanctuary, became her entire world. In the long, silent hours, with only the crackle of the fire and Eli's shallow, rasping breaths for company. Her mind began to wander back. She remembered her life in St. Louis, a life of such quiet, ordered stillness it seemed to belong to another person. She remembered sitting at her embroidery, her needle-making tiny, perfect stitches, her thoughts as contained and orderly as the pattern on the linen. Her voice, then, had been soft, her opinions always deferred. She recalled a dinner party where her father had been discussing politics with a guest. Ada had ventured a thought, something she had read in a newspaper, and her father had laughed, a gentle, dismissive sound. "My dear Ada," he had said, patting her hand, "such complex matters are not for a lady's mind to worry over." And she had fallen silent, her cheeks burning, her voice stolen. She thought of her 2 years with Mort. He had not needed to be so overt. His method was more insidious. He had stolen her voice not by silencing it, but by making it irrelevant. Her thoughts, her feelings, her desires, they simply did not exist in his world. She had become a beautiful, functional object, and objects do not speak. The silence he had imposed on her in that locked room had been the final, absolute expression of his power. He had tried to turn her into a ghost. Now, she looked at her hands, red and raw from hauling wood, chapped from the cold water. She looked at the bloodstains on her dress that would never wash out. She was not a ghost. She was a raw, living, fighting thing. The voice she had lost was not in her throat. It was in her hands. It was in the steady way she held the rifle, in the grim determination with which she cleaned his wound, in the ferocious, stubborn will that kept the fire burning and his heart beating. She was fighting to keep someone else alive, and in doing so, she was bringing herself back from the dead. On the morning of the 4th day, the fever broke. She woke from a brief, shallow doze in a chair she had dragged near the fire to find his eyes on her. They were no longer glassy and unfocused. They were clear and aware, and they were watching her with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "Water," he rasped, his voice a dry croak. Relief so profound it was painful, washed over her. She brought him the pot, helping him lift his head to drink. He drank deeply, then lay back, exhausted by the small effort. He looked at the clean bandage on his shoulder, then back at her. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the gauntness of her face, the fierce, protective light that still burned in her gaze. His recovery was slow. For the first week, he could do little more than sit up, his back against the wall, while she tended to him. The forced inactivity was a torment for him, but it created a space for a new kind of intimacy to grow between them. The silence was no longer one of wary distance, but of comfortable companionship. She would tell him about the books she had read, describing the plots and characters with a passion he had never heard from her before. He, in turn, told her about the stars, pointing out the constellations through the gaps in the cabin roof, telling her the Cherokee names and the stories that went with them. One afternoon, as she was redressing his wound, he reached up with his good hand and caught her wrist. His touch was gentle. "Thank you, Ada," he said, his voice still rough but steady. She finished her work, her eyes downcast.
"I would not let him win,"
she said softly. "Not like that." He was silent for a long time, just watching her. "I have spent my life seeing women as things that needed to be saved," he said, his voice quiet and thoughtful. "My mother, from the poverty my father left her in. Other women, from men who would use them up and throw them away. I thought I came back for you to save you." He paused, and his grip on her wrist tightened slightly. "I was wrong." He looked at her, and his gaze held a respect so deep, so absolute, it felt like a physical touch. "You are not someone who needs saving, Ada," he said, his voice filled with a quiet awe. "You are someone who makes men want to be better." Tears, hot and sudden, filled Ada's eyes and spilled down her cheeks. They were not tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of validation. the release of a pain she had not even known she was carrying. For the first time in her life, a man had seen her not as a daughter, not as a wife, not as a possession, but as a person, strong and complete in her own right. She did not wipe the tears away. She let him see them. While Eli healed in the mountains, Mort Caro rode, the story of his wife's kidnapping, so neat and convenient at first, was beginning to unravel. Word had trickled back from Last Chance Gulch of a shootout, of his foreman and another man bested not just by the half-breed, but by his wife, who had fought like a cornered wildcat. The whispers in the saloons and general stores were changing. People were beginning to wonder if Mrs. Caro had been kidnapped after all. They were beginning to wonder if she had run. This shift in the narrative terrified Mort more than the loss of Ada ever could. His power was built on a foundation of absolute control. He controlled the land. He controlled his men, and he controlled the story of his own life. Ada's defiance was a crack in that foundation. If he could not control his own wife, how could he control a valley? He was no longer just a wronged husband. He was becoming a fool. He rode out from the ranch with 2 men, the most ruthless trackers he could find. One was a grim, silent man who had once hunted Comanche for the army. The other was an Apache scout, a man whose skills in the wild were legendary, a man who could read a trail in a single broken twig or a scuff mark on a stone. Mort was no longer sending his hired guns. He was leading the hunt himself. This was not about bringing his wife home. It was about finding a thing that belonged to him and destroying the man who had helped it escape. It was about restoring his story to its proper order. Back in the cabin, the world began to change. The deep snows of the high country began to recede, melting into rushing torrents that fed the streams. The tight, frozen buds on the aspens began to swell, and the first green shoots of spring pushed their way through the damp earth. The air grew warmer, filled with the scent of pine and wet soil. As Eli's strength returned, they fell into a new rhythm. They were no longer just fugitives. They were homesteaders in a secret kingdom of 2. He showed her how to find the wild onions that grew by the creek, and they planted them in a small, tilled patch of earth behind the cabin. He fashioned a hook from a nail and a line from a thread of his blanket and caught small, silvery trout in the stream. For the first time in months, they had fresh food. One day, Ada took the horse and rode a few miles down the mountain, scouting the trails, nailed to a tall pine tree. At a place where 2 paths crossed, she found it, a new wanted poster. Eli's face, still a crude likeness, stared out from the paper, but the bounty had changed. It was now $1,000, a fortune, enough to make any man a hunter. She ripped the poster from the tree, her hands trembling with a cold rage. She rode back to the cabin, and without a word, she threw it into the fire, watching until the last of her husband's lies had turned to ash. The new poster was a reminder that their peace was borrowed time. Eli started her shooting lessons again. This time, it was not about hitting a can. He taught her precision, how to control her breathing, how to track a moving target. "Do not waste a shot," he told her, his voice serious. "In a fight, you may only get one. Make it count." In the evenings, she taught him. She had carried the memory of her music with her, a silent symphony in her mind. Using a piece of charcoal from the fire, she drew the lines of a musical staff on a smooth piece of stripped pine bark. She drew the notes, explaining the sharps and flats, the heartbreaking minor keys and the soaring majors. She would hum the melodies, her voice soft in the quiet of the cabin, and he would listen, his head tilted, his expression one of deep, quiet concentration. He was learning a new language, one of beauty and order, a world away from the violence and chaos he had always known. One afternoon, while she was down at the stream, Eli took his knife and carved something into the heavy wooden beam that ran above the fireplace. When she returned, he said nothing, but gestured with his head. She looked up. There, carved deep into the aged wood, were 2 sets of initials, A, C, and E, S. They were enclosed in a roughly carved heart. It was a simple, almost childish gesture. But it was a claim. It was a statement that this place, this brief, stolen time, was theirs. The peace was so profound, so complete. It felt as if it could last forever. They had carved out a life from the edge of the world, a life of shared work, shared knowledge, and a quiet, unspoken love that had grown as steadily and surely as the green shoots of spring. It was a beautiful lie. One morning, the air was crisp and clean, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. Ada was outside, tending to their small garden, while Eli was down by the stream, fishing. She heard the birds singing in the pines, the gentle rush of the water. It was a perfect, peaceful moment. It was shattered by the sharp whip-crack of a rifle shot. The sound pierced the quiet, echoing off the mountainsides. It was followed by a man's cry of pain. Eli. Ada's blood ran cold. She straightened up, her heart hammering in her chest, and looked toward the stream. A second shot rang out, and a chip of bark exploded from the tree just above her head. They were not alone. Mort's men had found them. The rifle shot was a punctuation mark, ending the chapter of peace they had written for themselves. Ada's world, which seconds before had been filled with the scent of warm earth and the hum of insects, was now a vortex of terror. The second shot, the one that splintered the tree beside her, was a declaration of war. They had been found. "Eli!" she screamed, her voice tearing through the mountain quiet. She saw movement in the trees down by the stream, a man in a dusty coat, raising his rifle. Without thinking, Ada dove for the cabin, scrambling over the threshold just as another bullet thudded into the door frame where her head had been. She snatched Eli's rifle from its pegs by the door. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was a block of ice. Breathe out slow, squeeze the trigger, make it count. She heard a cry from the stream, a sound of pain that ripped through her soul. She risked a glance out the small, grimy window. She saw Eli, half hidden behind a large boulder, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side, a dark stain spreading across his sleeve. He was holding his Colt in his right hand, firing back toward the trees. Two men were advancing on him from different angles. A third, she realized with a jolt of panic, was circling around toward the cabin, intending to trap them in a crossfire. This was it, the moment she had trained for. The fear was a living thing inside her, a cold, coiling serpent. But something else was there, too, a white-hot rage. These men had come to destroy the one small corner of the world where she had found a life. They had come to drag her back to a cage. The man circling toward the cabin broke from the cover of the trees, running low, his rifle held ready. He thought her unarmed, a helpless woman cowering inside. It was the last mistake he would ever make. Ada rested the barrel of the rifle on the windowsill, took a steadying breath, and lined up the sights just as Eli had taught her. She saw not a man, but a target, a threat that had to be eliminated. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the recoil a solid, brutal punch. The roar of the gun filled the small cabin. Through the smoke, she saw the man stumble, his hands flying to his chest. He looked down, a look of profound surprise on his face, then pitched forward into the dirt and did not move again. One down. The shot drew the attention of the other two. One of them turned his rifle toward the cabin, giving Eli the opening he needed. A single, sharp crack from his Colt echoed from the rocks, and the second attacker crumpled to the ground, his rifle clattering against the stones. The third man, the one who had shot Eli, was the tracker with the Apache blood. He saw his two companions fall within seconds of each other. He saw the flash of the rifle from the cabin window. This was not the easy bounty he had been promised. This was a death trap. With a curse, he fired one last, wild shot in their direction, then melted back into the dense pine forest. He was not running in fear. He was retreating to bring back the pack. Ada ran from the cabin, her feet flying over the uneven ground. She reached Eli as he was trying to push himself up from behind the boulder, his face pale and slick with sweat. The bullet had gone clean through the fleshy part of his forearm. It was not as bad as the shotgun wound, but he was bleeding freely, and his face was contorted in pain. "He is gone," Eli grunted, clutching his arm. "He will go back to Mort." Ada helped him to his feet, her mind racing.
How long do we have?
"A day, 2 at most, if we are lucky." He looked at their small, peaceful clearing, at the bodies of the men who had invaded it. The sanctuary was broken. The dream was over.
We have to run again, deeper into the mountains.
Ada looked at his wound, at the exhaustion etched on his face, at the vast, unforgiving wilderness that surrounded them. She saw a lifetime of running, of looking over their shoulders, of waiting for the next rifle shot. She saw a slow, lingering death, a death of 1,000 cuts, and in that moment, she made a decision. "No," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with the finality of cold steel. Eli stared at her, his brow furrowed in confusion and pain. "Ada, there is no choice. Mort will come back with 12 men."
I know,
she said, her eyes meeting his. They were no longer the eyes of a frightened woman. They were the eyes of a strategist, a general surveying the field of battle. "That is why we are not running. He will not stop hunting us. He will not stop until we are both dead, or I am back in his house. Running only delays it." She took a breath, the cold mountain air filling her lungs. "He will not stop, so we will end it." And they left the cabin that afternoon. They did not look back. Ada rode in front, setting a hard, steady pace, not east into the unknown, but west, back toward the Blackwood Valley, back toward the heart of the beast. Eli, his arm bound tightly, rode behind her. He had argued, but not for long. He had seen the look in her eyes. The woman he had rescued from a locked room was gone. In her place was a woman leading them into a war she had no intention of losing. Her time in the wilderness, once a trial of survival, now became their greatest asset. She had learned the land, not as an owner, but as a creature who lived within it. She knew the hidden game trails, the box canyons that could become traps, the high passes that offered a clear view for miles. She was no longer a damsel fleeing through a hostile landscape. She was a queen moving her pieces across a board she knew better than her opponent. She was taking the fight to him. They skirted the main trails, traveling through country Mort's trackers would deem impassable. As they drew closer to the valley, Ada's plan took shape, born of a desperate, brilliant clarity. She was not just going to confront Mort, she was going to dismantle him. They made their last camp in the foothills overlooking the town of Redemption. The lights of the saloons and houses were scattered below them like fallen stars. It was a place she had once loathed, a symbol of her husband's power and her own confinement. Now, she saw it as a stage. "You will stay here," she told Eli, handing him the rifle. "Find a place in those rocks where you can see the whole main street. If he tries to take me, if anyone lays a hand on me, you know what to do."
Ada, this is madness,
he said, his voice a low, urgent plea. "He will kill you." "He will not kill me in front of the whole town," she countered. "He cares too much for his reputation. He will try to play the part of the concerned husband, rescuing his mad wife." She took his good hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "I am not the same woman who left this valley. Eli? He thinks he is hunting a frightened doe. He is about to find a wolf." The next morning, she rode into Redemption alone. She had washed in a cold stream, mended the tear in her dress, and brushed her hair until it shone. She looked not like a haggard fugitive, but like a woman who had been on a long, trying journey. She looked respectable. She left the horse at the livery and walked down the center of the main street. The effect was instantaneous. Doors opened. Faces appeared in windows. The town, which had been bustling with the morning's business, fell into a stunned silence. Men stopped in their tracks. Misses, Caro, the poor mad wife who had been kidnapped by a savage, had returned. She walked directly to the center of town, the crossroads between the general store, the saloon, and the bank, and she stopped. She stood there, her back straight, her head held high, and she waited. It did not take long. The news reached him at the ranch, and he rode into town like a conquering hero, his face a perfect mask of relieved concern. He dismounted, a smug, triumphant light in his eyes, and strode toward her, his arms outstretched. "Ada, my dear," he boomed, his voice carrying across the silent street for all to hear. "Thank God, you are safe." The townspeople, gathered in a wide, silent circle, watched, ready for the satisfying conclusion to the drama. The wronged husband, forgiving and noble, the lost wife, returned to the fold. Ada did not move. She let him come close, so close she could smell the bay rum on his skin. But when he reached for her, she took a single step back. "Do not touch me, Mortimer," she said, her voice not loud but clear and cold, carrying in the unnatural quiet. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face, but he kept his smile in place. "My dear, you are overwrought. You have been through a terrible ordeal. Let us go home." "I am not going home," Ada said. She turned her head slightly, so she was addressing not just him, but the entire town. "I am not mad, and I was not kidnapped." A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. Mort's smile tightened. "Ada, this is not the place." "This is the only place," she cut him off, her voice rising now, filled with a strength no one there had ever heard from her. She pointed a finger at her husband, her hand steady. "This man did not rescue me. I fled from him. I fled from his cruelty, from his silence, from the prison he made of my life." She turned her full attention to the crowd, her eyes sweeping over the familiar faces of the mayor, the banker, the ranchers, the wives. "You all know Mortimer Caro, the generous man who funds your church steeple. Did you ever ask him where his money came from? Let me tell you, it came from this land." Her voice rang with passion. "Land he bought for pennies from the government after the Cherokee were driven from it, the same people his trackers now hunt for bounties." She saw the Apache scout, the one who had escaped, standing near the saloon, his face a stony mask. She met his eyes without flinching. "He speaks of order and progress," she continued, her voice gaining power with every word. "But his order is built on fear. Ask the hands who work for him what happens when they ask for a fair wage. Ask them what it is like to live in his debt. Ask Mr. Henderson over there how he came to sell that northern pasture to my husband for half its worth after his barn mysteriously burned down." A gasp went through the crowd. Mr. Henderson, a small, timid rancher, went pale. "And he speaks of my delicate nerves," Ada said, her voice dripping with scorn. "He told you he was sending me to an asylum for my own good. The truth is, he locked me in my room and starved me for 3 days because I dared to defy him in public, because I would not be his perfect, silent possession." She looked directly at the women in the crowd, at the wives who knew the quiet tyrannies of their own homes. "He did not want to cure me. He wanted to silence me, just as he silences anyone in this valley who stands against him." The crowd was no longer a group of passive spectators. They were listening, their faces a mixture of shock, dawning anger, and for some, a furtive, guilty recognition. The story Mort had so carefully crafted was shattering before his eyes. Mort's face was now a thunderous mask of pure rage. The pretense was gone. "She is lying," he snarled. "The half-breed has filled her head with poison." "No," a voice called out from the crowd. It was Henderson, the small rancher, his voice trembling but clear. "She is not lying about the pasture. He threatened me. He said accidents happen." Another voice joined in, a former ranch hand. "He pays starvation wages and beats any man who complains." The dam of fear had broken. Mort was losing control. He looked from face to face, seeing not the deference he commanded, but the contempt he had earned. Humiliated and enraged, he turned on his heel and strode toward his horse. "I will not be judged by this rabble." He mounted and spurred his horse into a gallop, riding back toward the one place his power was still absolute, his ranch. The final standoff happened an hour later. A silent, grim procession of townsfolk, led by the mayor and the sheriff, followed Ada out to the Caro ranch. Eli had come down from the hills, his rifle held loosely in his good hand, and walked at her side. They found Mort on the veranda, a shotgun resting in the crook of his arm, his few remaining loyal hands arrayed behind him. He was a king in his castle, making his last stand. "Get off my land," he roared. Eli stepped forward, raising his rifle. "It is over, Mort." The two men faced each other, a tableau of the Old West, the powerful ranch baron and the outcast gunslinger. But this was not their story to finish. Ada stepped between them. The crowd gasped. She walked directly to Eli, the man who had been her protector, her partner, her quiet love. She looked into his eyes, a silent communication passing between them. Then she reached out, took the heavy rifle from his hand, and turned to face her husband. She held the weapon for a long moment, feeling its weight, its potential for finality. She looked at Mort, at his face, contorted with hatred and defeat. She could end it, one shot, and it would all be over. The justice of the gun. But that was his way, not hers. Slowly, deliberately, she turned and held the rifle out to Eli. It was not a plea for him to act. It was a transfer of power, a final, absolute act of trust. She was giving him the choice, and in doing so, claiming her own. Eli took the rifle. He looked at Mort, the man who had hunted him, who had put a price on his head, who stood for everything that had ever wronged him in his life. He could kill him. The whole town would call it justice. He raised the rifle to his shoulder, and then he lowered it. He looked at Ada, at the woman who had taught him that strength was not just about enduring, but about choosing a better way. Vengeance was a fire that consumed everything. Justice was a house you could live in. "Drop the gun, Mort," Eli said, his voice calm and steady. "The town has heard the truth. There are witnesses now." Mort looked at the faces in the crowd, at the sheriff's hand resting on his pistol, at Eli's unyielding stance, and finally at Ada's calm, resolute face. He was surrounded, not by guns, but by the truth. He was a king with no subjects left. With a cry of pure, impotent rage, he threw the shotgun to the ground. Mortimer Caro was arrested that day, based on the testimony of a dozen townspeople who, emboldened by Ada's courage, finally found their own voices. They returned to the cabin in the mountains, not as fugitives, but as free people. The air had never smelled so sweet. The sun never felt so warm. They rebuilt the broken door, patched the roof, and planted a larger garden. They were not running from the world anymore. They were building their own. One night, they sat by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the initials carved into the beam above them. The silence between them was no longer a space of caution, but one of deep, abiding peace. Ada leaned over and kissed him, a slow, gentle kiss filled with all the words they had never needed to say. She pulled back and looked into his eyes, her own shining in the firelight. She whispered, her voice full of a quiet, triumphant joy. "Let them watch. Let the whole world know I chose you." Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. We would love to know where you are tuning in from, so drop a comment below to connect with fellow listeners. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts with us in English.